I said that right. It too is likely to be wiped out by Panama disease. But there's good news. Here's what Capel says. For the past 5 years, banana scientists have been trying, in a race against time, to modify the fruit to make it resistant to Panama disease, as well as more than a dozen other serious banana afflictions. The best hope for a more hardy banana is genetic engineering. I'm still quoting him. Work in the lab that adds DNA from one organism to another. That's the good news. Now there's some bad news. I'll go on and quote Capel. But even if genetic engineering succeeds, there's an excellent chance people won't want to eat and won't be allowed to eat. Such products are currently banned in much of the world. Bananas that gain newfound strength from the insertion of genes originally found in everything from radishes to fish. In other words, some people don't want to, but a whole lot more people aren't going to be allowed to by their governments. And that means the banana might disappear. Now, you might say, big deal. I'm more upset by that. Bananas are my favorite fruit. But...
Hear, hear.
I persuaded someone of something. But I don't depend on bananas for my survival. Hundreds of millions of people in Africa and Asia do. And the problem is, if they don't get those bananas, they'll be worse off. As Capel writes again, in many other parts of the world, bananas, more than rice, more than potatoes, are what keep hundreds of millions of people alive. If they lose their bananas, the results could be devastating. Ironically, Capel seems to see fair trade as a solution. Why ironically? Because he doesn't actually seem to have read the criteria for fair trade. As I mentioned earlier, a good cannot be labeled fair trade if it is genetically modified. Section 3611 of the December 2007 Generic Fair Trade Standards for Producers states, quote, the organization ensures that its members do not grow any genetically modified products. Genetically engineered seed or planting stock should not be used. Now, it's true that governments in Europe have been particularly intolerant of genetically modified foods. So even if fair traders become more tolerant, that doesn't necessarily mean the European governments will. So it still might not be a solution to get rid of fair trade. But still, why add to the problem? We're talking here about whether fair trade is desirable. Fair trade, to the extent it's successful, will discourage people from pursuing the solution to disease that's most likely to work. And as I said, that could wreak havoc on the lives of hundreds of millions of poor people. It's also true that these hundreds of millions will probably not let European governments dictate what they can and cannot eat. So you might argue that genetic modification will proceed with or without the European governments, and with or without fair trade. But here's the problem. And it's the same problem that comes up in a different context. That is, why is there not a vaccine for malaria? Most of the people in the world who really fear malaria are very poor, and therefore can't afford to pay enough that a drug company will have the incentive to come up with a vaccine. Similarly with bananas. To the extent European governments and governments of other wealthy countries and fair trade advocates either prevent or, in the case of fair trade, persuade people to buy just fair trade products, that is, not genetically modified, they'll reduce the incentive to make the investments that would be necessary to genetically modify and preserve the banana. You could argue, and quite reasonably, that fair trade won't have this effect because few people will insist on buying fair trade products. I can argue that. If you're against fair trade, you can argue that, but the fair traders cannot argue that. It makes no sense to argue for fair trade and then hope that you don't convince people. Recently, Barack Obama delivered one of his best lines when he criticized Hillary Clinton for saying that she voted for a bill, quote, but was glad to see it didn't pass. Obama said, if you didn't want to see it pass, you vote against it. Similarly, if you don't want fair trade to prevent a solution to the world's banana problem, then not only should you not, a la Hillary, hope that fair trade fails, but you should do your best to make it fail. So is fair trade fair? I gave two senses of fairness. In the first sense, it's not. In the second sense, the unfairness of the consumer, it is. You, the consumer, are told about the great virtues of fair trade, and most of these virtues are highly exaggerated. Moreover, to the extent fair trade prevails with bananas, it will prevent or at least slow down the solution that could preserve the banana. Whether that's unfair, I don't know, but it's certainly nasty. Now, to say that fair trade is unfair is not to say we can't do anything to make the world's poor people better off. It's just that there are much more direct solutions. One solution which would make us better off as well as poor people in poor countries is to immediately end all trade barriers. Get rid of that 15% tax on bicycles I mentioned. Get rid of all tariffs. Get rid of all restrictions on imports, import quotas. Trade barriers in both forms, tariffs and import quotas, restrict trade and drive down the net price that producers receive, making them worse off. Trade barriers also drive up the price that we consumers pay. So eliminating trade barriers would make all of us better off. And of course we can help poor people in poor countries but even more directly, by giving them money. I'm not talking about government-to-government aid. This has been a spectacular failure and has bred corruption. I'm talking about person-to-person foreign aid, which is successful. If you really want to help the world's poor people, here's what you can do. If you're buying fair trade products, figure out the extra premium you're paying for those products through a year, figure out whatever that number is, and then give that amount of money to people in poor countries, and you will make them better off for sure.
David for his speech. Now, speaking in first opposition is Mike Gidney. Mike is the chairman of the Fairtrade Foundation, so please give him a warm welcome.
Good evening. So this House is being asked to believe that fair trade is unfair. Let me say from the start, I believe this to be a false proposition. There can be nothing unfair about a scheme in which farmers, businesses, consumers all participate of their own free will. There is a free choice, they participate voluntarily, away from which they could turn whenever they choose. If it's free and open and accessible to come in or go out, there is no coercion, there is no obligation, it is not unfair. I think that's a firm ground for dismissing this as a rather spurious notion. But let's go more deeply into it, because I think if you look at who is involved in fair trade, you will see that actually it's impossible for it to be unfair. Let's look at who's involved. Who are the major stakeholders of fair trade? The farmers, the consumers, and the businesses. And I'll talk about each of them in turn. So, is fair trade unfair to farmers? Bearing in mind, if you will, that they enter into this of their own free will. Nobody forces them into it. Now, one of the favourite accusations levelled by the theorists is that fair trade somehow shackles farmers into primary production. They're stuck on their farms, picking and growing, and nothing more forever. They'll never be able to move up the value chain. They'll never be able to add value. They'll never be able to get into processing. They'll never be able to diversify. Wonderful in theory, in practice, it's simply not true. Anybody who goes beyond an initial level of research, anybody who actually takes the trouble to speak to a farmer or a grower in the fair trade system, can see just how dynamic a farming sector it really is. So